Okay. Thank you very much. So my name is Dell. I'm a PhD student at the London School of Economics. Today I will actually be presenting something slightly different than what my abstract was about, but I think it's actually maybe more relevant to the theme of future-oriented policy. It does use a methodology that's more common in economics, don't be afraid, but I am very curious to get thoughts from people outside of economics because it's, in my mind, not really for an economist audience, potentially. Okay, so what is degrowth? So degrowth is a critique of capitalism's growth mandate. It is a call for an equitable downscaling of consumption and production, typically of the most highly sort of carbon-intensive industries, but of the economy as a whole in some ways as well. It calls for a shift toward different values, including community orientation, conviviality, a prioritization of well-being over profits and GDP. And it targets affluent countries, mostly of the global north, who have historically been the highest emitters, so it directly integrates climate justice. And more broadly, it can encompass an activist movement, a policy agenda, which will be the focus of today, and a scholarly project. Let me just keep going. Okay, so this project motivation, so in my digging into the degrowth literature during my PhD, I found there was very little empirical work regarding perceptions of specific degrowth policies, although there was a lot of attention paid to designing these policies. And there was much less attention paid as well to the adoption of sufficiency behaviors, which I will explain what sufficiency means in a second, and how these behaviors relate on the micro level to more broad support for degrowth at the macro or policy level. Despite calls in the literature for a need to connect strong sustainable consumption or sufficiency with this broader agenda of societal transformation. And there's also very little research on degrowth in America, which is where I'm from. Maybe unsurprising, but I think the results will then surprise you if you think that way. So this is a broader piece, but today I'll be talking about one research question, which is how does the adoption of sufficiency or reduced consumption behaviors relate to degrowth policy preferences? So sufficiency is an agenda for restricting consumption within planetary boundaries whilst ensuring at least a minimum level of societal protection is met for all and reinforcing a good quality of life for all. So it's related to degrowth, and it's sort of, you can think of it as a value that is important to degrowth. And one paper looked at different types of consumption changes towards sufficiency, so on a more individual level. These include absolute reductions, which would be, for example, cutting out meat or flying. Modal shifts, which would be biking to work instead of driving. Product longevity, which would be buying more durable goods instead of buying fast fashion, for example. And sharing products, which would be, for example, using a tool library as opposed to buying a set of tools for yourself. So in the case for degrowth, which is one of the bigger sort of pop degrowth books, they set out this sort of general pathway from lifestyle changes to a degrowth transition. And fundamentally, which is quite different from environmental psychology literature, degrowth doesn't believe that lifestyle changes itself will create the mitigation scenario necessary to avoid climate breakdown, but rather a lifestyle change toward sufficiency or toward more community orientation might bring about a reassessment of societal values. So it might shift things toward more, open sharing, focus on the commons, which might then enhance support for degrowth policies, which could then ultimately lead to this societal transformation. There's very little empirical work on this sort of pathway, so I've been really intrigued into trying to dig into whether or not this is potentially possible. So in the literature more broadly linking behavior and policy, there's mixed evidence on the relationship between pro-environmental behaviors and policy support, and there's sort of three general hypotheses. So one, engaging in PEBs can lead to lower policy support, so this sort of licensing effect. Or engaging in PEBs might catalyze policy support by wanting to sort of maintain a social identity or an environmental identity, maintain internal consistency. And then a third idea, which is that they're actually only weakly correlated through intrinsic pro-environmental motivation. But no paper that I've come across has really looked at sufficiency behaviors as the type of PEB and degrowth policies specifically. So in this project, we had a few different phases. So it started with a literature review, which allowed me to sort of select specific policies that would be most relevant to study in the experimental design, which we were looking at, which is a discrete choice experiment, and I'll explain that a bit later. And then we went into a focus group round where we asked a very convenient sampled group of Americans, or a few groups of Americans, about these policies and trying to really pinpoint which levels of the policies would be appropriate, most feasible, and most sort of realistic for this scenario. So very anecdotal takeaways from the focus group. I haven't actually analyzed this data very legitimately, but from just my sort of understanding of the focus groups, and I would love to talk to call researchers to think if I can make this a bit more legitimate, but so the themes that really came out to me were a lack of trust in government to make any sort of policy changes that would actually benefit the general public, which is quite sad. Support for ideas and values related to degrowth, but people had very little faith that others would actually support these sort of changes. Whenever we talked about sort of sustainability very generally, people really focused on these lifestyle shifts and individual behaviors and really didn't think about policy support as their role in making a difference. And finally, there were a lot of concerns regarding policy equity and concerns of not burdening the worst off in society with some of these policy changes. So a discrete choice experiment is a quantitative technique for eliciting preferences, and it can be used when there is an absence of revealed preference data. And the method often involves asking individuals to state their preference over hypothetical alternative scenarios. It can be goods, it can be services. In this case, we use policies as our sort of scenarios and our attributes. So DCs are fundamentally characterized by attributes and different levels of these attributes, where you systematically vary these levels of the attributes so that you can sort of measure trade-offs. And I've created a very simplified version here. So there are 3 attributes, and the monetary attribute being the sort of cost. There are 3 choice sets, so everyone would see these 3 choice sets every time, but the levels within, and they would see the same attributes every time. The levels within these would vary. So you can see there are 2 levels of each attribute, and if we go to the sort of next set of choices that they might get, you can see attribute 2 changes, but everything else stays the same. And again, attribute 1 may change, and this will happen systematically for several rounds so that you can really pinpoint these trade-offs. Fundamentally, the status quo doesn't change because that is currently what is in existence. So those are the current policies related to some of the things we're talking about in America, and then we've created or constructed the levels of attribute 1 and 2. So for the sufficiency side, we also measured a battery of 12 activities, mostly related to reducing consumption, and I got these from my supervisor's work on extinction, which is a paper that's in progress. And we looked at a variety of domains, so for example, resource use, food choice, and transportation, and these are some example statements. So the attributes. We picked 4 degrowth policies as our attributes, and there are many, many more in the literature, but these were sort of the core that were both some of the most popular and the most relevant to the American context. So first one was work time reduction. So we gave a range from 5 days, and so the status quo was 5 days, 40 hours a week. This ranged from 5 days, 35 hours a week to 4 days and 28 hours, and there were 3 levels in total. And then we gave some reasons why working less might be relevant for creating a more sustainable society. We then looked at fossil fuel limits. So this was government limits on extraction and production of fossil fuels, which ranged from caps, or an annual cap, to a full ban. And again, we gave reasons why, which I can't go into for time. We also looked at limits on advertising. So we looked at limits on advertising of high emissions goods, so things like animal products and long haul flights, private jets. And we gave them those examples, and this ranged from removing those ads in the public domain or public spaces to a full ban on those ads. And then healthcare coverage. This is America. Unfortunately, this isn't America, but that was America. There's no universal healthcare yet, so we gave 2 options, which was an expansion of Medicaid to be at a much higher income threshold, and then a universal healthcare for all incomes. And very importantly, we had to state that private insurance options would still be available, because that came out in the focus groups as something that people were really afraid of. So it's always good to do some qual. So then, importantly, DCE needs sort of costs and benefits to really contextualize these choices, otherwise there wouldn't really be anything that they were trading off between. So we have an emissions reduction, so these are the sort of benefits. So we ranged from 50, 60, and 70%, and this is from 2005 levels of emissions by 2030. And then there was also a cost, which would be an increase in the household income tax burden of 1%, 3%, 5%. Importantly, this was only for households making less than 600K, which was sort of roughly the 1% or the 99%. And for the 1%, you would multiply these increases by 5 each time. So it would be 5%, 15%, and 25%. And that was to deal with this sort of equity or people being concerned about burdening those with lower incomes. So this is an example of the choice card that people would get, and they would get 8 of these, and we would sort of systematically vary the same, and we did this using a Bayesian efficient design, so it required a few rounds of perfecting which choice cards would be included, and several pilots. So the sample was, we recruited through YouGov, and we tried to recruit a representative sample, which didn't really work out that well. It was a little over 1,000 participants. The median age is about almost 10 years older than the median in the US, so this is an older population. It was representative of all 50 states, and the median political identity is quite moderate, so it's literally 5 out of 10, and if you look at the distribution, it's like that. And there was a higher proportion of white, non-Hispanic participants in our sample than in the general population, so slightly overrepresented. So, results. How does the adoption of sufficiency behaviors relate to degrowth policy preferences? So first we used the multinomial logit model. So this assumes preference homogeneity, so assumes everyone basically has the same preference, which is not a great assumption, but it's the simplest model. And we included an interaction with the sufficiency behavior scale, both as a binary, so whether or not you've engaged in sufficiency previously in the past year, and as a continuous measure. So when we look at it as both binary and continuous, we do see there's a link between those who engaged in sufficiency or engaged more often, having higher preferences for the more ambitious resource limits, so caps or bans on fossil fuels. And when we only look at the binary model, we do also see that people who engaged in sufficiency had higher preference for more ambitious advertising limits as well on high emissions goods. These are just the numbers to say that numbers do exist, but I'm really not going to go into it because they're very difficult to interpret. Anyway, latent class model is another model that does not assume preference homogeneity, but rather assumes that there is heterogeneity of preferences that can be grouped into classes or groups. And so the researcher defines a number of classes, and you run this model several times with a different number of classes, compare information criteria, and you try to sort of pinpoint the best model. So we found that our best model had 3 classes where we included sufficiency behavior as the sort of interaction, and we included age, education, and employment as a link covariates as well. And in this we use the binary measure of engagement or non-engagement in sufficiency behavior. Again, don't worry about the numbers, but you can see there's class A, class B, class C. Class C has a lot more significance than A or B. So there's a lot, so you can see there's different preferences across the 3 groups, basically. So I'm using these terms very loosely to describe the classes. So class A we called the individual environmentalist. So they did support alternative policies over the status quo, and they preferred a fossil fuel cap to a ban, but that was really the only degrowth policy that they supported. So they were more sensitive to tax increases than other groups, and they were the most likely to practice sufficiency. And I have this asterisk because they were more likely, significantly, than Class B, who didn't support any degrowth policies. They were not significantly more likely to engage in sufficiency than Class C, but they did have a higher level. Class B, we call this the climate skeptic. So they didn't really support any degrowth policies. They preferred the status quo, and they were the least likely to practice sufficiency. And then finally, the degrowther supported the alternative policies, and they preferred all of the degrowth policies except for the advertising restrictions. That was not significant, but everything else was significant. And they were less likely to have tax increases as well. And these people have more likely engaged in sufficiency behaviors in the past year. So if we look at class allocation, the class C, which are likely to practice sufficiency and supportive of most of the degrowth policies, is actually, you can't see the probability, but it is 0.6. So it's actually the highest probability by far of the three groups, which was quite surprising for me. So the way that a light class model works is that it is a probabilistic model. So these aren't perfect, if I go back, these aren't perfect sort of descriptions of the groups, but rather the probability that one would fall into that group. So Class C had the highest probability of people falling into that group, and we were able to sort of pinpoint a bit more strategically the characteristics of each of these groups, looking at a more granular level, and we could compare using null hypothesis testing these characteristics. So we found people in Class B, this is the climate skeptics, had lower belief in climate change, lower trust in government, they were less likely to believe poverty was beyond one's control, they were older and further to the right politically. Class C had higher scores on voluntary simplicity, so wanting to reduce consumption, they were more highly educated, higher in climate knowledge, they were higher income further to the left and less likely to be Hispanic, which I think are some of the more interesting and important ones, thank you. To talk about, this is compared to Class B, so this is compared to other people who are likely to practice sufficiency. They are higher income, further to the left, less likely to be Hispanic, and more highly educated. So this is my last point. So basically, it appears that there's actually a lot more support for degrowth policies in America than either the media or academic literature would suggest. I think that's quite encouraging as an American and as a citizen of the world. There is clearly an association between engagement and sufficiency behaviors and some support for degrowth policies. So this sort of pathway of sufficiency lifestyle changes toward transformation might be relevant. However, being more concerned with sufficiency was not always related to higher support for degrowth policies, and there might be some crowding out effect. And it's very context dependent on individual characteristics, so it depends on education level, climate knowledge, income, political ideology, and ethnicity. So in conclusion, we really need to think about how to engage people outside of the white, high-income, highly educated groups that, if anyone knows anything about degrowth, appears to dominate the space, and it's really important to bring other people who would probably benefit more from a degrowth transition along with us. So that's everything. Thank you.